Some men spend their whole lives chasing respect, hoping one day somebody will finally admit they deserve a seat at the table. Me? I never wasted my time asking for permission. I spent decades building my own table from the ground up, one board at a time. And when one arrogant man decided my son wasn't worthy enough to sit at his, he had no idea he'd just picked a fight with the wrong family. You'll understand everything that happened after that if you understand one thing about me first. I don't lose my temper often. I don't yell. I don't threaten people. I stay quiet, watch carefully, and wait. Then, when the time is right, I make my move. That's always worked a whole lot better than shouting ever could. It all started on a chilly Thursday morning in late September in Louisville, Kentucky. The kind of morning where the air feels clean enough to breathe deep, and the trees have just started trading their green leaves for shades of red and gold. I was standing in my garage, working on a 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle I'd been restoring little by little for almost 4 years. Music played softly through an old radio, while the smell of motor oil and fresh coffee filled the room. Then my phone started vibrating across my workbench. I wiped my hands on a rag before looking at the screen. Ethan. That immediately caught my attention. My son never called during work hours unless something serious had happened. I answered before the second ring. Hey, buddy. Everything okay? Nothing. For several seconds, all I could hear was breathing. Not normal breathing. It was the kind of shaky breathing a grown man makes when he's trying everything he can not to break down in front of his father. Then I finally heard his voice. Dad. That single word told me more than any explanation ever could. My stomach tightened instantly. Where are you? I'm over at Riverfront Park. His voice cracked again. Can you come get me? I didn't waste another second. Stay exactly where you are. I'm on my way. I grabbed my truck keys without even bothering to clean the grease from my hands. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot overlooking the Ohio River. I spotted him immediately. He was sitting alone on an old wooden bench near the water. Well, not completely alone. Next to him sat my grandson, little Mason, only 6 years old. His small backpack rested neatly on his knees while he quietly held a chocolate milk box with both hands. Kids have a way of knowing when something is terribly wrong, even if nobody explains it to them. Mason wasn't crying. He wasn't asking questions. He just sat there, unusually quiet, watching his dad with worried eyes. 2 large duffel bags rested beside the bench. The second I saw those bags, my heart sank. People don't usually carry their entire lives in 2 duffel bags unless something has gone terribly wrong. I parked the truck, walked over, and sat beside my grandson first. I wrapped one arm around his shoulders. He leaned against me without saying a word. For a few moments, the 3 of us simply watched the river drift by. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. Cars crossed the bridge. Boats floated downstream. Leaves slowly fell onto the water. Meanwhile, my son's entire world had just fallen apart. Finally, I looked at Ethan. Why aren't you at work? He let out a laugh that barely sounded human. There wasn't a bit of happiness in it. It was the kind of laugh that only comes after someone's run completely out of tears. I don't have a job anymore. I stared at him. You got fired? He slowly nodded. This morning. The engineering company? Yeah. The place you've worked almost 7 years? Yeah. I took a slow breath before asking the next question. And the bags? He rubbed both hands over his face. Lauren asked me to leave. I stayed quiet. He continued before I could ask anything else. Actually, she didn't come up with it. He looked down at the ground. Her father did. That made me turn toward him. What do you mean? He came over last night. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. He told me I'd never be good enough for his family. I didn't interrupt. He said he had connections with executives at my company. Another pause. I thought he was bluffing. He shook his head slowly. He wasn't. The wind picked up along the riverbank. Mason kept sipping his chocolate milk like nothing around him made any sense. My father-in-law made one phone call. Ethan's voice had become almost a whisper. And this morning they fired me. I clenched my jaw. Richard Harper? My former father-in-law now. That answer hit even harder. I looked directly at him. What do you mean, former? His eyes filled with tears again. Lauren filed for divorce this morning. I felt like the air had disappeared from around us. Everything happened since last night. He nodded. Her dad told her if she stayed with me, he'd cut her out of the family business. Another long silence. Then Ethan said something I'll never forget. He looked me in the eyes and said our family name wasn't worthy enough to stand beside theirs. Those words hung between us like a storm cloud. Family name. Funny how people with money start believing they invented the world. I looked over at Mason. He noticed me staring and held up his drink. Grandpa, I smiled. Yeah, buddy. It's chocolate. He said it like it was the most important thing anyone had ever needed to know. I couldn't help smiling. Kids have a gift. Even on the worst day of your life, they somehow remind you there's still something innocent left worth protecting. I squeezed his shoulder. That's my favorite too. Then I stood up. Slowly, calmly. The same way I always do whenever I've already made up my mind. I reached down and picked up one of the duffel bags. Grabbed the other one. Ethan blinked. What? The bag. He stared at me. Dad, where are we going? I looked him straight in the eyes. We're going home. He knew that tone. Every son knows it. It's the voice that says the conversation is over. Without another question, he picked up the second bag. As I held Mason's hand and walked toward my truck, only one thought kept repeating itself inside my head. Richard Harper believed my family was small. He believed we had no influence. He believed we'd simply disappear. He couldn't have been more wrong. Because the biggest mistake a proud man can make is underestimating a father who has spent his entire life quietly building something nobody else knows exists. The drive back to my house took a little over half an hour, but it felt much longer. Nobody spoke. The only sounds inside the truck came from the tires rolling over the pavement and an old country song playing quietly through the speakers. Mason eventually fell asleep against the passenger door, still holding his empty chocolate milk box like it was a prized possession. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Ethan glanced at me every few minutes. I could tell he wanted answers. He expected me to give him one of those speeches fathers are supposed to give when life falls apart. Something about keeping your chin up or believing everything happens for a reason. But that's never been my style. Words don't rebuild broken lives. Actions do. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Ethan looked around with tired eyes. The house hadn't changed much in the last 25 years. It was the same two-story brick home where he'd grown up. The same porch swing his mother loved. The same oak tree we'd planted together when he was still in elementary school. To anyone driving past, it looked like the home of an ordinary, retired mechanic. That's exactly how I wanted it. I'd spent decades making sure nobody looked twice at me. Come on, I finally said. Let's get inside. Mason woke up the moment I opened his door. Are we staying here, Grandpa? For as long as you need. His face lit up instantly. Can I sleep in Dad's old room? I laughed. I think we can make that happen. Within minutes, he was running through the hallway like he'd never left. Kids recover faster than adults. Sometimes I envy that. Ethan carried the bags upstairs before slowly making his way back into the kitchen. He looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. Like someone had ripped away every plan he'd spent years building. I poured us each a cup of coffee before sitting across from him at the table. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, he broke the silence. I don't know where I went wrong. You didn't. He shook his head. I must have done something. No. I tried so hard with their family. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table. I went to every holiday dinner. I know. I helped Richard remodel his lake house. I remember. I coached my nephews during baseball season because he asked me to. I remember that too. His eyes became watery again. I treated them like they were my own family. I know you did. So why wasn't it enough? I leaned back in my chair. Because people like Richard don't judge effort. Ethan looked at me. They judge status. He frowned. I don't understand. They spend their whole lives believing a person's value comes from money, titles, expensive neighborhoods, and the names on business cards. I took a sip of coffee. The funny thing is, those are usually the people who know the least about real character. He stared down into his mug. I feel like such a failure. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his shoulder. Listen to me. He slowly looked up. A man who gets knocked down isn't a failure. I paused. A man who refuses to get back up is. He nodded, though I wasn't sure he believed me yet. Just then Mason came running downstairs, wearing one of Ethan's old high school hoodies that nearly reached his ankles. "Grandpa, what is it, buddy? Your pancake still better?" I laughed louder than I had all day. "You questioning my cooking?" He grinned. "I want to check." "Well then," I said, standing up. "Looks like tomorrow morning we've got an important job." For the first time since I'd picked them up, Ethan smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. That was enough for me. Later that night, after Mason had fallen asleep, Ethan stepped onto the back porch where I was sitting alone. The autumn air had turned cold. I was watching the stars. He sat beside me without saying anything. After several minutes, he finally asked the question I knew was coming. "Dad." "Yeah." "How are you so calm?" I smiled. Because panic never fixed anything. "No. I mean," he searched for the right words. "You don't seem angry." That almost made me laugh. "Oh, son." I looked out across the dark backyard. "I'm angrier than I've been in 30 years. His eyebrows lifted. "You are. I just don't see any value in showing it." He stayed quiet. "When somebody hurts the people I love, I folded my hands together. I don't waste energy yelling. I start thinking." "Thinking about what?" "About the next move." He looked confused. "You mean revenge?" I slowly shook my head. "No." "What then?" "Justice. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional. Justice is patient." Richard Harper had acted like he held all the cards. Maybe he believed that. Maybe everyone around him believed it too. But there was one thing he didn't know. Actually, there were several things he didn't know. He didn't know why I'd always driven an old pickup instead of a luxury SUV. He didn't know why I'd never bragged about money. He didn't know why I'd retired before turning 60 and somehow never seemed worried about paying bills. Most importantly, he had absolutely no idea what I'd spent the last 34 years building behind the scenes. I stood and looked toward the detached garage at the far end of my property. Inside sat more than classic cars. Behind that garage was another building. Plain. Metal. Nothing special. Most people assumed it was storage. They were wrong. Very wrong. Tomorrow morning, my son was going to learn the truth. And once he did, Richard Harper's entire view of our family would never be the same again. I was already awake before the alarm had a chance to go off. Old habits don't disappear just because you get older. For more than 3 decades, I'd been getting up before sunrise, and retirement hadn't changed that one bit. By the time the coffee finished brewing, I was already sitting on the back porch watching the first light creep over the trees. The morning was peaceful. Too peaceful. Inside the house, Mason was still asleep. Ethan wasn't. I heard him walking around upstairs long before he finally came down. He looked a little better than he had the day before, but only a little. Losing your job, your marriage, and your home in less than 24 hours isn't something you recover from overnight. "Morning," I said. He forced a smile. "Morning." I handed him a fresh mug of coffee. "Get dressed." He looked at me. "For what?" "We're going somewhere." He frowned. "Where?" "You'll see." He knew better than to keep asking questions. After breakfast, Mason happily stayed behind with my neighbor, Mrs. Dawson. She had practically adopted him before lunchtime, already promising to bake cookies and teach him how to make homemade apple pie. The kid looked like he'd won the lottery. Once we knew he was settled, Ethan climbed into my pickup. We drove in silence for nearly 40 minutes. The farther we drove, the more confused he became. We left the quiet neighborhoods behind and headed toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. Large warehouses appeared one after another. Distribution centers, machine shops, manufacturing plants. Eventually, I turned onto a private road lined with neatly trimmed trees. At the end of it stood a modern glass and steel building that stretched farther than Ethan could probably see from the truck. Its design wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Real success rarely announces itself. A polished stone sign stood near the entrance. Iron Ridge Industrial Systems. Ethan stared at it. Dad. His voice barely came out. What are we doing here? I parked the truck, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked out the windshield for a few seconds. There it was. 34 years of work. Thousands of 14-hour days. More sleepless nights than I care to count. Countless risks. Hundreds of employees. Everything I'd built without anyone outside a very small circle ever knowing. Finally, I looked at him. This place belongs to us. He blinked. I'm sorry, what? I own it. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I've owned it for 34 years. He stared back at the building. No. Yes. You mean the whole company? He laughed nervously. I think you're joking. I've never joked about business. His eyes moved from the building to me and back again. You've got to be kidding. I wish I were. I climbed out of the truck. He stayed frozen for several more seconds before slowly following me. Inside the lobby, everything was spotless. Large windows filled the space with sunlight. Employees greeted each other while walking toward morning meetings. Nobody looked stressed. Nobody looked afraid. That was always important to me. People spend too much of their lives at work to hate every minute of it. The receptionist looked up and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Morning, Linda. She noticed Ethan standing beside me. This must be your son. It is. She stepped around the desk and offered him a warm handshake. It's nice to finally meet you. Ethan looked completely lost. You knew I existed? Linda laughed. Your dad talks about you and Mason all the time. His eyebrows shot up. He does. Every chance he gets. I pretended not to hear that part. No reason to embarrass myself. A few moments later, the elevator doors opened. A tall man in his early 60s stepped out wearing a navy blue suit. He walked straight toward us with a huge smile. Good morning, Jack. Morning, Tom. He shook my hand firmly before turning toward Ethan. So this is him. I nodded. My son. Tom smiled. It's been a long time coming. Ethan looked back and forth between us. What's going on? Tom chuckled. I've been hearing about you for nearly 20 years. Ethan looked even more confused. You have? Oh, absolutely. Tom slapped me lightly on the shoulder. Your father never stops talking about how proud he is. I noticed Ethan quietly looking away for a second. He was trying not to get emotional. I pretended not to notice. Some moments deserve privacy, even when you're standing right next to someone. Tom led us through secured doors and onto the production floor. The building came alive immediately. Robotic equipment moved with perfect precision. Massive machines cut steel with unbelievable accuracy. Forklifts traveled through clearly marked lanes. Teams worked together like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Nearly 300 employees filled the facility. Nobody rushed. Nobody panicked. Everyone simply knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan slowly turned in a full circle. His jaw had practically hit the floor. You build all this? One building at a time. When? Over 34 years. Why didn't you ever tell me? That question had been waiting for a long time. I smiled. Because I wanted you to become your own man first. He stayed silent. If people know your father has money. I looked around the factory. They'll always wonder whether you earned your success. He nodded slowly. I never wanted that for you. We continued walking until we reached the executive offices overlooking the production floor. Tom opened a large conference room door. Several department managers were already waiting. The moment I walked in, every person stood. Not because they had to, because respect had been earned over many years. I turned toward Ethan. I think it's time everyone met the future of this company. Every head in the room shifted toward him. His eyes widened. He looked at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Dad. I smiled. No, son. I pulled out the chair beside mine. It's time you learned why I spent my whole life building this place. And it's also time you found out why Richard Harper has been doing business with us for almost 8 years, without ever realizing whose name was on the front door. Ethan froze. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I saw something replace the hopelessness in his eyes. Hope. The conference room stayed completely silent. Every manager sitting around the table looked at Ethan with polite curiosity, while he looked like he'd accidentally walked into the wrong building. He leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I smiled. "I'm talking about your future." He shook his head. "No, I'm an engineer. I don't know anything about running a company like this." "You know more than you think." "I seriously don't." I pulled out a chair and motioned for him to sit. "Then today is your first lesson." Once everyone had settled down, I cleared my throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce my son, Ethan Brooks." Several people smiled and nodded. A few had obviously heard plenty about him over the years. Others were meeting him for the first time. "This company has always been about family," I continued. "Not because we're related by blood, but because we take care of each other. That's the culture we've built here, and that's exactly how it's going to stay." The room filled with quiet agreement. Tom slid a folder across the polished conference table toward Ethan. "Go ahead," I said. He slowly opened it. Inside were company financial reports, organizational charts, and a detailed summary of every major client. His eyes moved from page to page. Then they suddenly stopped. He looked back up at me. No way. I already knew what he'd found. The name was impossible to miss. Harper Industrial Supply. Richard Harper's company. One of our largest vendors. Ethan looked back down to make sure he wasn't imagining things. This is Richard's business." "It is." "And he's been working with you?" "For almost 8 years." He blinked several times. "He never mentioned you." I chuckled. "That's because he never knew." The room became very quiet. Tom folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Harper has always dealt with our purchasing department. Jack preferred to stay out of the spotlight." Ethan slowly looked around the room. "So all this time," he paused, "my father-in-law was making money for my dad's company." Without realizing it, he leaned back in his chair. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." I slid another folder toward him. "This one's more important." He opened it carefully. At the very top was a formal employment offer. Director of Vendor Relations. His eyes grew wider. "Dad." The salary printed beneath the title made him stop reading altogether. "This has to be a mistake." "It isn't. I've never managed people." "No. I've never negotiated million-dollar contracts." "Not yet." He looked completely overwhelmed. "I can't do this." I leaned forward. "Tell me something." He looked at me. "When Richard asked you to rebuild the deck at his lake house, did you figure it out?" "Yeah." "When your company promoted you to lead engineer, had you done that job before?" "No." "But you learned." "I did." "When Mason was born, did anyone hand you a manual explaining how to become a father?" A small smile appeared on his face. "No." "You learned that too." He nodded. "You've been solving problems your entire life." I pointed toward the folder. "This is just a bigger problem." The managers around the table smiled. Tom finally spoke. "Your father isn't offering you this position because you're his son." Ethan looked over. "He's offering it because every person in this room already knows your reputation." "My reputation?" Tom nodded. "You've spent years treating people fairly. You've earned respect without asking for it. You've led teams. You've solved difficult problems. Those qualities can't be taught. The business side can." Another executive spoke up. "We'll help you. So will everyone else in this building." Ethan looked around the room again. For the first time in 2 days, he didn't look defeated. He looked hopeful. He picked up the offer letter once more. "You really believe I can do this?" "I know you can." He took a deep breath before signing the last page. The moment his signature touched the paper, several people around the table applauded. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just genuine support. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been that proud. After the meeting ended, Tom and I walked Ethan through the executive offices. Every department manager stopped to introduce themselves. Nobody treated him like the owner's son. They treated him like someone who had earned the chance to learn. That mattered to me. Respect given too easily usually disappears just as fast. As we reached my office overlooking the production floor, Ethan walked over to the windows. Hundreds of employees were working below with incredible precision. You built all of this. He still sounded amazed. I had a lot of help. He turned around. Why stay hidden? I walked over beside him. When I was your age, your grandfather owned a small construction company. I remember. People found out he had some money. I looked out over the factory. Within a year, friends started asking for loans. Family members wanted investments. Business partners became greedy. People stopped seeing him. They only saw what he owned. Ethan stayed quiet. I promised myself I'd never make the same mistake. So I lived simply. I drove old trucks. I stayed in the same house. I kept my head down. And while everyone else was busy trying to look successful, I smiled. I was busy becoming successful. He laughed. I guess Richard never saw that coming. No. I looked out across the production floor. And that's exactly why he underestimated us. Just then, my office phone rang. Tom answered it before handing it to me. It's purchasing. They say Richard Harper is on line 1. I looked at Ethan, then at the phone. A slow smile crossed my face. Looks like he finally figured out who owns the company. I handed the receiver to my son. I think this call belongs to you. Ethan stared at the phone for several long seconds. Then he slowly reached out and answered it. Ethan stared at the phone for what felt like forever. He looked at me, then back at the blinking light on my desk. You sure about this? I nodded once. It's your call. He took a slow breath before pressing the speaker button. Hello, this is Ethan Brooks. For a couple of seconds, nobody said anything. Then Richard's voice finally came through. Ethan. His tone was completely different from the last time my son had heard it. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the arrogance. All that remained was uncertainty. Yes. I wasn't expecting you to answer. I work here. Another long pause followed. Richard cleared his throat. I received a notice this morning about a contract review. That's correct. There has to be some mistake. Ethan glanced toward me. I simply folded my arms and leaned against the window. He didn't need my help anymore. He was doing just fine on his own. Our company has always met every deadline, Richard continued. We've delivered quality products for years. We appreciate that. Then why are payments being frozen? Ethan calmly opened the evaluation file lying on my desk. Our vendor review process requires every major supplier to undergo periodic performance assessments. Richard interrupted. But this has never happened before. It has. Not to us. Policies change. His voice remained steady, professional, respectful, exactly the way I'd hoped. Richard took another deep breath. Ethan, this isn't about business, is it? My son didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned another page in the report. When I work for your family, he finally said, you always told me that business decisions should never be emotional. Another silence. I took that advice seriously. Richard didn't respond. This evaluation follows company policy. Nothing more. You don't understand. Richard's voice had softened. If this contract stops. He hesitated. We'll have to lay people off. Ethan looked toward the production floor below us. Hundreds of employees were busy doing their jobs. People with families. People with mortgages. People depending on steady work. He understood responsibility better than Richard ever realized. I don't want anyone losing their job. Neither do I. Then help me understand what I need to do. Ethan slid the revised agreement closer. Our purchasing department has prepared updated contract terms. They're fair. They're realistic. And they'll protect both companies. Richard was quiet while reading. Finally, he spoke again. These numbers are reasonable. They are. The delivery schedule is achievable. It is. The pricing is actually better than I expected. We're interested in long-term partnerships. Richard let out a slow breath. I honestly thought. He stopped himself. You thought what? I thought you were trying to get even. Ethan smiled faintly. If I wanted revenge. He paused. This conversation would sound very different. The room became completely silent. Even I found myself smiling. That answer told me everything. He'd learned the lesson. Real strength isn't about humiliating people. It's about staying in control when you finally have the power to do otherwise. Richard spoke again, this time much more quietly. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me one. I do. No. Ethan looked out the window before continuing. You owe one to your daughter. Another pause. And you owe one to your grandson. Richard didn't say anything. You judged me because my family didn't have your last name. Ethan's voice stayed calm. You thought success came from money. You were wrong. Another long silence settled over the office. Finally, Richard spoke. I've made a lot of mistakes. Yes. I don't expect forgiveness. That's between you and your family. I know. His voice cracked for the first time. I miss Mason. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. So does he. Those 3 words carried more weight than an entire speech ever could. Richard swallowed hard. Will you tell him I asked about him? I will. And Lauren? Ethan thought for several seconds. That's a conversation you need to have with your daughter. I understand. He sounded like a completely different man. Not because he'd suddenly become humble. Because for the first time in his life, nobody could buy his way out of the consequences. Ethan signed the revised agreement. You'll receive the updated contract this afternoon. I'll sign it. I know. Before hanging up, Richard quietly said one last thing. Ethan, yes. Your father raised a better man than I ever realized. Ethan looked over at me. I simply smiled. Thank you, he replied. The call ended. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Tom finally broke the silence. I've known your dad for 26 years. He looked at Ethan, and I don't think I've ever seen him prouder than he is right now. I laughed softly. Let's not embarrass the kid. Ethan shook his head with a grin. I think I'm finally starting to understand you. Oh, you never wanted people to know how much you had. No, you wanted them to show you who they really were first. I smiled. Exactly. Money has a funny way of acting like a spotlight. It doesn't change people. It simply reveals who they already are. Richard had revealed himself years ago. Today, my son had revealed the man he'd become. And if you ask me, that was worth far more than every building, every machine, and every dollar I'd spent the last 3 decades earning. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly. People came in and out of my office, asking questions, discussing projects, and updating us on production schedules. Ethan listened carefully to every conversation. He wasn't trying to pretend he already knew everything. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and took notes whenever someone explained a process. That told me more than any resume ever could. The best leaders aren't the ones who always have the answers. They're the ones willing to keep learning. By the end of the day, most of the employees had already stopped referring to him as the owner's son. To them, he was simply Ethan. And that was exactly what I wanted. When we finally drove back home, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills. Orange light stretched across the sky, making everything look calm again. Mason came running out of the house before I had even shut off the truck. Dad. He wrapped both arms around Ethan's waist. I made cookies. Ethan laughed for the first time in days. You did. Mrs. Dawson stepped onto the porch, brushing flour from her apron. He also sampled about half the cookie dough before we even turned the oven on. Mason looked up with a completely serious face. I was quality testing. I couldn't help laughing. Well, somebody had to make sure it was safe. The little guy grinned from ear to ear. Watching the two of them together reminded me why everything that had happened mattered. None of this had ever been about money. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about protecting the people who depended on me. That had always been my job. A week later, something happened that none of us expected. Lauren showed up at my front door. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, and it was obvious she hadn't been sleeping much. When Ethan opened the door, neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "Can we talk?" He looked at me. I simply nodded and stepped back inside, giving them the privacy they deserved. They spent nearly 2 hours sitting on the porch. Neither one raised their voice. There was no arguing, no accusations, Just two people trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Later that evening, Ethan came inside. She didn't know, he said quietly. I figured. Her dad lied to her. I figured that too. He told her I'd been fired because I wasn't good enough. I shook my head. People who build their lives on pride usually end up lying to protect it. Ethan sat down across from me. She apologized. And I forgave her. I smiled. That doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. I know, but Mason deserves parents who at least try. I couldn't argue with that. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about deciding that bitterness isn't worth carrying anymore. Another month passed. Business continued as usual. Ethan settled into his new position faster than I ever expected. He treated every supplier fairly. He listened before making decisions. Most importantly, he earned the respect of every employee without ever demanding it. One Friday afternoon, Tom walked into my office carrying a newspaper. He tossed it onto my desk. Across the business section was a photograph of Richard Harper. The headline read, "Local executive announces retirement following company restructure." Tom smiled. Guess he's finally slowing down. I looked at the article for a moment before folding the paper shut. I hope he finds some peace. Tom raised an eyebrow. That's all you've got to say? What else needs to be said? He chuckled. I suppose you're right. The truth was, I didn't feel any satisfaction watching another man fall. Life had already taught him lessons that no enemy ever could. Holding on to anger would only weigh me down. I'd rather spend my time enjoying what truly mattered. That evening, the three of us drove out to the lake where Ethan and I used to fish when he was a boy. Mason insisted on bringing his tiny fishing pole, even though it was much too small for the fish in that lake. He didn't care. He was there for the adventure. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the water, he looked up at me. Grandpa. Yeah, buddy. When I grow up, he thought for a second. I want to work with Dad. Ethan smiled. You do? Mason nodded. And maybe with you too. I reached over and ruffled his hair. We'd like that. He looked back toward the lake. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are we rich? Ethan laughed softly. I looked at my grandson for a long moment before answering. We're lucky. He tilted his head. What's the difference? I smiled. Rich people have money. I looked at Ethan. Lucky people have family. Mason thought about that for a few seconds. Then he smiled. I think lucky is better. So do I. As we packed up our fishing gear and walked back toward the truck, I realized something. For years, I believed I was building factories. I thought I was creating jobs. I thought I was growing a business. But standing there beside my son and grandson, I finally understood the truth. The company had never been my greatest achievement. Not even close. My greatest accomplishment was raising a son who chose integrity when he finally held the power to take revenge. Because real strength isn't measured by how hard you can hit back. It's measured by how much character you keep when the opportunity to destroy someone is sitting right in front of you. Money comes and goes. Businesses rise and fall. Titles eventually disappear. But the values you pass down to your children, those become your real legacy. As we drove home beneath the evening sky, I smiled to myself. The road ahead looked peaceful. For the first time in a long while, it finally felt like our family was headed exactly where we belonged.